Hello everyone, this is Elias Martin of CollectingJapanesePrints.com. Welcome to Woodblock Wednesday, where on Wednesdays we get together and discuss Japanese prints, paintings, history, and culture. Today's Woodblock Wednesday is on an artist who's, I think, who's really underrated and whose abilities really outshine in a lot of genres, well, in a couple genres, and in a lot of styles. And what I've done is I've pulled together all prints available on my website, as well as some that will be on my website soon, of prints by Toshi Yoshida from the very famous Yoshida family of artists. And so I've put together a nice group that shows the evolution of his artwork. And I think it'll be a really good comparison. So without further ado, let's go to the table and see what I brought. So I'm going to pan out as I normally do, and you could see so many different prints that are on the table. And so let me get my cheat sheet here. So I have my notes. So I guess where I'll start is we'll talk about Toshi Yoshida and his background. You know, Toshi Yoshida, his dates are 1911, and he passed away in 1995. So relatively recent. Well, I think it's recent. I remember the 90s quite well. But anyway, yeah, so Toshi Yoshida was born to Hiroshi Yoshida, a very famous woodblock print artist that I'm sure all of you are familiar with. And if not, please familiarize yourself with Hiroshi Yoshida's work. And we've discussed Hiroshi Yoshida quite a bit in our Woodblock Wednesdays. He was also born to a mother who was very talented, Fujio Yoshida. And she produced woodblock prints as well as oil paintings and watercolors. We've also discussed her work in previous Woodblock Wednesdays. And to be fair, I have discussed Toshi Yoshida briefly in some Woodblock Wednesdays as it related to certain exhibitions I had up. But today's Woodblock Wednesday is dedicated just to him and a consideration of his varied body of work. And so just to fill in the gaps, Toshi, of course, was born to, as I said, Hiroshi and Fujio Yoshida. And he also had a brother, Hodaka Yoshida, as you might be familiar with. And Hodaka was he was younger, and he was interested in more sort of contemporary abstract works. He's more known as a Sosaku Hanga artist and a contemporary artist as opposed to a Shin Hanga artist. But Toshi, because he was the older son, he was sort of groomed to take over the family business. And of course, Hiroshi Yoshida was not a fan of abstraction. He was a representational artist working within the Shin Hanga paradigm. He produced some beautiful landscapes and some portraits, but mostly landscapes. And Toshi really took his cues from his father early on. He started actually becoming interested in his father's work when Toshi was actually quite young. He was sick and he had an illness, and which kept him in bed most of the time, and he quickly started drawing. And as he felt better, he started sort of walking around and poking around the Yoshida family studio and watched his father carve blocks and artisans print the prints, and he became much more involved. And he made his first early prints pretty much early in life. He was in his 20s when he was starting to become I hate to call him was an apprentice, but he did learn how to carve blocks and produce prints. He understood all of the process of the prints production, like his father. I don't know how well his father carved blocks, but because his father had really great artisans to do that. But his father was a fantastic oil painter and watercolorist. And Yoshida did take on those disciplines as well. He did do some oil paintings and some watercolors. But Toshi was much more talented in terms of the woodblock printing process, at least the way I see it, because he was much more involved. He carved his own prints in many cases and printed the impressions. And it's something I don't think his father could do as well. And also, Toshi was known more as a colorist. His brilliant use of color, as well as light, really shines through his compositions, particularly the ones I'm showing you today. Toshi's work really, though we look at his early work and it looks similar to his father's, there are aspects that are very much Toshi's own, and I'm going to highlight those. So, I said a lot about Toshi, just generally speaking, but what I want to focus on is what makes him his own artist and what makes him a really great artist. So in this print, this design is called Ishiyama Temple. I believe it's from 1946. So it was done right after the war. And there's some aspects of this print I want to point out. First of all, this print has a seal. I believe that's called a Jikoku seal. And the point of that seal is it looks like a Jizuri seal, but it's not. What that seal means is he actually carved this block entirely himself. And of course, he had artisans to print the print. I'm not suggesting that this impression was printed by Toshi, but it could have been because he did know how to print the prints. And so what we have here is this interior scene of this temple. And it's a stunning scene because what we have here is these great lanterns being shown that are hung in the at the ceiling of the temple, and then we have this really wonderful light that's coming through, and the light affects every element of the composition. You could see how it touches and makes the lantern softer in areas. You could see the lighter aspects of the lanterns as the light comes through, and the ones that are sort of hidden away are a little darker. It's just fantastic. And the other thing I want to point out about this composition is that I think the people that populate the design are really well done. The kimonos are really well done. The just the overall silhouette of the figures as well as the faces are really well articulated. And one thing about Hiroshi Yoshida's work, Toshi's dad, is that he used figures more to sort of as a backdrop. He used them to certainly populate his compositions, but they were used to get a sense of scale and then just as sort of an ornament. And for Toshi, he actually used figures in a different way. He used figures to create, certainly they add to the composition, but they also have a character onto themselves, which greatly contribute to the composition. So they're not just these sort of statues that are part of the composition, but they're animated living beings that are populating and contributing greatly to this composition. And I think this is one of my favorites from this early period. But I brought one more to show you that is in contrast to an interior temple scene. This is, a landscape. It shows this wonderful wisteria at Ishijima. It's Yushijima. Let me get my notes. I'm trying to read this quickly. And, by the way, I should point out, all of Toshi's prints are signed in pencil, and then they're titled. A lot of them are titled with a stamp. So it's not. It looks like a pencil signature or a pencil titled, hand titled in pencil, but it's not. It's a stamp. But the signatures are all done by hand, which is important. I should point out for collectors, there are later impressions being produced by the family as well as other outlets, and the prints. I'll point this out. For example, if this was a later printing, what you would see. You would see a series of characters on the back of the print. And that is a telltale sign that it's not a lifetime impression. You would think that you would rely on the signature, except those signatures are stamped and they look deceivingly like a live signature. But if you look at it with a loop, you will see, like in this stamped title, you would see little breaks within the signature. And so here you see no breaks because it's a live signature. Here, if you look at the title, again, we see a little break in the T of the temple, a little break in the I for Ishiyama. And so that's something you should be aware of. For these lifetime impressions, you need to see a live signature, and you should never see a series of Japanese characters on the back. Stay away from those. I mean, I should say this. I wouldn't stay away from them. They sell, I think, for far more than they should, because you could get the originals relatively close to those prices. I've seen this print. This is on my website. I think it's like $1,200. And I've seen these stamped signatures that are later not done by Toshi or not done under his supervision sell for $800, $850. And I mean, it doesn't make sense to me, because if you could get, for a few more $100, you could get the original done under the artist's supervision. It makes much more sense to me. So anyway, I wanted to throw that out there. A lot of places, particularly online auctions, don't even mention that they're not printed during the artist's lifetime. And that's just really a problem. And I want all of you to be aware of what the telltale signs are when you're looking at original prints by Toshi during his lifetime. So I wanted to say that. So let's get back to the artwork. So in this piece, we have this wonderful wisteria tree. And you see the really active trunk and roots that are coming up. And then you see of course, the branches that are just wonderfully arranged. What you can't see is that they're suspended by a support. And then what you have is these wonderful wisteria blooms coming down. And Toshi, besides creating a wonderful composition, it's very active. These soft purple wisteria blooms are just sort of suspended and coming down. And that's a really good counterpoint to the active trunk of this tree. It really works as a counterbalance. And the background is done in this wonderful yellowish gold. It's not gold mica. It's just pigment. But if you're used to seeing Rinpa school screens with gold background, this basically harkens back to that sort of style, and it suggests that. And so when I look at this print, my eyes always think that there's gold mica on the background, because I'm just sort of used to seeing that. But in this case, it's all done with pigment on paper. No silver or gold applications of mica were added. And then, I just want to zoom in so you could see also the moss that's covering the trunk. You really do get a sense of the age of this tree and the spirit of it, the character of the tree. Particularly, how Toshi frames this whole composition. It's stunning. It really is stunning. And as an artist, you're looking at this gigantic wisteria. You just have to kind of, you look at it and you go, how do I capture what I'm seeing? I mean, it's so big, and it's kind of hard to get a sense of scale. And here, it's interesting because he crops most of the wisteria. He only shows you a portion of it. And what he's elected to do is to really show you how active the trunk system is of this tree, which I think is a really fascinating perspective and vision of this artist. So I'm going to come back and I just want to show you the detail. I didn't do that on this print. Okay. Now, I want to point out that in Toshi's body of work, he produced quite a few of these representational pieces. But it's interesting because after his father passed in the mid-50s, Toshi was able to start experimenting with abstraction. And there were artists in Japan that were interested in abstraction since the early 1900s. Toshi. Koshiro Onchi produced the first work of abstraction in 1915 or 1914. You can argue about the date, but the point is, abstraction was something that artists really considered throughout the 20th century. But it wasn't until the late 40s, early 50s when Onchi really pushed for abstraction did other artists pick up that mode of expression. And Toshi went through a transitional period. So we're looking at these are certainly representational works. And then, these were done in the mid to early 50s, 1954. This one's not dated, but it is done at this same time. And it's still not 100% abstracted. It's a composition of a portrait. And he did a series of portraits of women. Some of them were women from particular areas of the world. This one is called American Girl B. I have one on my website called American Girl A. I've sold that one, but this is the counterpart of that motif. And, he used these simplified forms. They're very calligraphic. These lines, do suggest calligraphy. They also suggest, it suggests a sense of a fluidity with calligraphy. But what I want to really say is it's a kind of a focus on geometry, and there's ovals, ellipses within the composition, and I find that kind of fascinating. It sort of reminds me of the work of Paul Klee, and so it has that element to it. And what I wanted to show, this is one of the books dedicated to the Yoshida family. Unfortunately, Toshi, there's no catalog raisonné for Toshi, and this book has a lot of artwork, obviously, for all of the Yoshida family. But this is a painting that Toshi Yoshida did. It's just a scene of I think fish, and in the water, and you could see the light rippling through the water. It's a stunning composition. It's kind of hard to show in terms of being on the screen. But the reason I want to point out is, of course, the print is here. And what I think is going on, if I read this correctly, you see how the rippling and his use of light throughout the composition, that is something he's playing with here. And so one of the arguments, if I should put it in those terms, that I want to make about Toshi is that he was really inspired by the representational world, and aspects of his representational work translated quite well as he started experimenting with abstraction. And so you could kind of see that sense of light that he was so fascinated with in this composition here, or even throughout his representational pieces. Light has always been a very important aspect of his work. And so we see that, and even in this very simplified form of a portrait of a woman, we get that, which I think is really interesting. And here, what we have is another work, much more simplified than in this design, This one is a trial printing. It's just called extra in this particular impression. Extra meaning an extra impression of a variant. So the finished print doesn't really look like this. This is just a variant, but I really like it. There's a really wonderful sense of light coming through. The form looks female to me. It's very soft. The lines are very oval and soft, but it also it has kind of a contemplative quality to it. And it has, it kind of reminds me of a Buddha or a bodhisattva, sort of in contemplation, and with the sense of light, emanating from the figure or focused on the center portion of the composition where the figure's face is. I think it's really wonderful. Now I want to zoom in so you could see the details. Just throwing out there, abstract artists draw their inspiration from all kinds of things, and many of them would argue that it's solely coming from their experience as a person, but as an emotional person, and it's more about their imagination. And I get that. I think all artwork is based in the imagination, but a lot of abstract artists reject the representational or even what they see in real life and say, no, this is completely a figment of my own inward observations of the mind. And I get that. But for Toshi, it's clear that he's making these connections where he's moving towards the abstraction, but he's still connecting his work to representational pieces, particularly light, how light appears in the natural world. And we see that in these two pieces. So let me see. Do I jump here? I'll move over around here. So I have here, let's see, there's 5 pieces that are done here by Toshi that are all purely abstraction. And so this one, well, you can get into an argument on this. This one is called Starlight, and one can argue that it has kind of a sort of a cosmic, star, star quality to it. And this, the data of that is 1973, so it's much later than the works from the late 50s, early 60s. But this is highly stylized. It almost has like a textile quality to it. But I could see what he's doing. The idea of a midnight sky with a brilliant canopy of stars that appear almost like a kaleidoscope. It's fantastic, and I really like this design. So I'm going to zoom in so you could see what I mean. What you may not be getting from this video is that the carving on here creates a wonderful sense of texture, despite the fact that this is a very atmospheric sort of composition, and it's almost ethereal as well. But the texture from the carving brings the viewer back to a more it really keeps the viewer back in their body, and you almost want to touch the surface of the print because it does have this tactile quality to it. And of course, that's just from the carving. And this showcases Toshi's really talented, his talent in making intricate designs with wood. It almost looks like a wood engraving, really, because when you come into it, you could almost keep going and see more and more detail. So I have to go quickly because there's 4 more to discuss. Now, this work is called Seaside, and I could see what he's doing. The green and the blues, it has a very strong oceanic kind of quality to it. But I also want to connect this work to his earlier work. There's also a wonderful sense of light coming through. this composition. And of course, it's very reminiscent of the colors of the window and the light coming in through the temple. And the way that I read this, and I sometimes read his abstraction with some representational elements. So, for example, I kind of see there's a fish going in this direction, and then another fish going in that direction. And I kind of see these like almost like bubbles or jellyfish, but at the same time, they're not. You know, they could be just purely abstracted forms that, you know, occur naturally in the water or in his own mind. But what I think what makes this design very successful is his use of color, which is dynamic. It's an active agent in this composition. It animates the design, and it really, without having fish, you really get a sense of fish moving through water. I'm going to zoom in so you could see the wonderful texture. Now, this is done in 1967, so this is much earlier than this work. And this reminds me of early work by Hoshi. And Hoshi, Joichi Hoshi, who was an artist that did designs of the night sky and the trees, these works kind of have a similar quality to them. But, of course, Toshi's doing something different. I mean, I kind of get a sense of texture on the surface of this, but the pigment is resting very evenly, and so there is no real texture on the surface. It's completely flat. But the way that he printed this gives you the sense that it's a painting, and there's all this pigment on top of pigment. Let's look at the back of this print. It's pretty even as well. So I'd have to say, you know, he did a wonderful job in this design to create that texture. All right, I'm going to move on quickly. There's a few more to look at. So I like this work because of the earth tones. This almost has kind of a calligraphic kind of, you know, I don't know how to describe it, but it reminds me of writing, like ancient hieroglyphics or something. And the date of this is 1973. His brother Hodaka went to Mexico in the late 50s and was there and produced work with an Aztec Mayan influence. And maybe that sort of influenced Toshi to create these designs. He did 2 or 3 of these with these, like I said, they almost look like hieroglyphics, but they're also just sort of abstracted forms. And you know this work reminds me of that. It also reminds me of a design he produced of interior scene of a cave, and so I could kind of see that as well. But in this composition, he also uses he creates these lines in the background that really give you a sense of depth, and it makes the figures and that are lighter and darker, it makes them jump out of the composition. I'm going to zoom in so you could see how much work went into carving this. I should also point out that Toshi was one of the only, I mean, I'd say maybe there's a handful of artists that were working in Japan making woodblock prints that can work in abstraction as well as representational at the same time. So this work was done at the same time when he was producing prints of his safari trips to Africa. And I bring this up because the background also reminds me of some of his African designs, particularly these lines. He would use these lines in the background to show antelope being, you know, either being chased by lions or running with the herd. And so I think he used those sort of techniques, but then he used them for different purposes in his abstract work. But it's interesting to make those connections because you could see the artist sort of making these decisions in his representational work, and then of course carrying those themes into his abstraction, but then modifying them. So I find it fascinating. It's unfortunate that there isn't any book on Toshi's body of work, because it would be nice to see his body of work in a sort of a linear fashion where you could kind of see his early work and then how he developed, but also see the complexity of his interests. I mean, he's doing representational things from Africa and then doing stuff like this at the same time. I mean, that takes a lot of skill to do that. And so I wanted to point that out. Now, the last two I want to show, I like this one. First of all, I just love blue, but this composition is fantastic. The background is done in tones of black and a very dark blue that create a wonderful backdrop to this very lively and active form. And of course, this was done earlier. This is done in 1952. So this is among the earliest designs of abstraction here. And this last one is done entirely in shades of gray. And I mean, just the carving on this is just astonishing how much work went into the carving of it. This one also reminds me of a textile, maybe, what are those textiles? E-cats. This does have that quality to that, but because it's done as a woodblock print, it gives it a sense of life. It's very active. I mean, I hope that sort of carries over to this video, because in person, when you see this, it looks like you could stand here and look at it all day, and it's moving around on you. So again, I'm going to start from the very beginning of our talk so you could see the diversity of Toshi's body of work, at least as I've showed it today. I mean, I could easily showed 100 prints by him, and you would have gotten quite a different view on each print. But this is sort of generally what you see in his body of work. Wonderful representational pieces that could at first blush look like a work by his father. And then, of course, his interest in simplification of form and portraits. And these are lovely. And then an interest in abstraction, but rooted with concepts of the natural world. And again, all of these are pencil signed, done under the artist's direct supervision. They do not have the series of characters on the back of the prints that you would see on later printing. So I would recommend being very careful in online auctions or galleries that do not indicate whether the print is done during his lifetime or not. That distinction is crucial when you're considering purchasing work by Toshi Yoshida. All right. And then I'll go back to this book because I always like to show publications. As I said, unfortunately, there's no Calog raisonné for Toshi, at least as of yet. But this book does do a wonderful job at showcasing the work of all of the Yoshida family of artists. And it's not just Hodaka, Toshi, Fujio, and Hiroshi Yoshida. There's also Chizuko, Ayomi. I mean, the family is so talented. It's really astonishing. And so this book really shows the body of work of all of the artists, which is great. And the cover piece is actually by Toshi. This is an abstract work done in, I think, in the 60s. So anyway, there's one more look at the table. Well, I want to thank all of you for joining me today on Woodblock Wednesday. I think we looked at quite a few pieces that show a really good overview of Toshi Yoshida's body of work. I hope you enjoyed them. And of course, I have these available. All of them are available for sale. A few of them are on my website now, and the others, the abstract works, will be coming. So if you have any interest in those, feel free to reach out to me. And of course, just there's a lot of information on my website. I encourage all of you to go there and check it out if you're interested in learning more about Toshi or other artists. I carry works by Shin Hanga, Sosaku Hanga, and contemporary artists. And of course, I have a bookstore that carries books on the artists and prints from all of these genres. So please have a look there. And lastly, I don't mention this often, but I'm going to start mentioning this. I'm also interested in buying artwork, not just selling it. So if you have Japanese prints that you're thinking about selling, feel free to reach out to me, and we'll discuss those. So thanks again for joining me, and I look forward to seeing all of you in the next installment of Woodblock Wednesday. Until then, thanks.